Good morning, everybody. You're very welcome this morning to this workshop on submitting poetry to the Mairtín Crawford Award, but also more generally, I think we'll be talking about submitting poetry into various places. So you're very welcome here this morning. And just to let you know that if you have any specific questions or anything you would like to ask, please put your questions into the chat and we can have a look at them later on. So I thought I'd start off just by maybe telling you all a little bit about Mairtín Crawford and why the award was set up. It was set up in 2017 in memory really of Mairtín, who was such a big influence to poetry, on poetry in the North in particular. Mairtín was a writer and a poet and an arts critic who died very suddenly and unexpectedly in 2004. His connection to the Crescent, he was writer in residence in the Crescent and a curator of the Between the Lines Festival, which was really the forerunner of the Belfast Book Festival. He was a key player in the very influential group of poets that gathered around Jarrow's Poetry Collective. He was editor of the radical poetry journal, The Big Spoon, and he managed the artistic and cultural content of Fortnight magazine, as well as being the magazine's production editor. He had a sense of mission, really, which characterized his artistic life. He focused very much on the underrepresented and the missing voices, was very inclusive to everyone. He forged a great friendship with Allen Ginsberg, and in 1993 he brought Allen Ginsberg to the Crescent for 2 readings. He also had a special bond with the poet Patrick Fake, and I think that the kind of slightly anarchic voice of Patrick Fake was echoed in Mairtín's own work. On a personal note, he was a very good friend of mine, and it was really to recognise just what he'd done for poetry and to encourage poetry and to encourage other voices in poetry that the award was set up. So I thought I'd start by reading one of his poems before we move on to more general discussion. Okay, this poem is called Untitled Sonnet. What are we looking for all these years? It can't be far from us, though seasons change light's sensuous quality and our perceptions alter irrevocably. Like autumn sunlight, its colder glance reminds us that there's more to life than summers of indolent repose. What we have, we cannot help but lose. None of it can go on forever. But behind winter, there's always spring. You can't go on in silence, imagining the pure idea of silence. Look out your window. The trees are waving in unison because the dead are returning to us, reborn in perfect new forms. That's a little example of Mairtín's poetry. On a practical level, the awards, they close on the 30th of April, so there's still lots of time to prepare your submission. And what Annemarie and myself are going to be speaking about this morning is how to go about that and maybe offering some tips and ideas as to how you might go about it. And I suppose what we're looking for as well in terms of what we're looking for when we read your submissions, which by the way are all read anonymously. We don't know who has submitted what. So I have, there might be questions, there might be sort of practical questions, I suppose, about the submission criteria and your eligibility. If you do have any of those kind of questions, please let us know through the chat. Annemarie, would you like to join us now and we can start to talk about some of the...
Welcome everyone, and thank you Moyra for that introduction and the lovely reading as well. It's very fitting to start with that opening line by Mairtín, what are we looking for? And in a way that kind of sets the tone for this session. It's a real delight to be judging these awards again this year with Moyra, and it's a highlight of my year to read these submissions. And we read all of the submissions, all of the hundreds of submissions really carefully. We read them blind, and there's a lot of behind the scenes writing and discussion and back and forth between myself and Moyra. And if we need support in our decision making, we have the Crescent Arts Centre there as well. So there's a lot of careful thought and consideration that goes into selecting the winners each year. And it's an important award because in a way it can be career changing for people. You know, awards are important milestones, I think, in a writer's career. You know, the same way that publishing is an important milestone, and that validation and recognition and the encouragement to go on is really vital. So I'm delighted the award is being made available again this year. So let's kickstart some discussion about the whole process of applying for the Mairtín Crawford Award. And if you're not at a stage where you're ready to apply for the Mairtín Crawford Award, or if you're not a debut writer, there'll still be lots in this discussion for you to kind of mull over. And keep putting your questions in the chats, and we'll try, and either I'll go in or Moyra will go in or somebody will, and get some of those questions out, and we can start answering them. And you can use this as a session to ask, you know, any questions about preparing submissions, sending work out, editing work, dealing with successes, dealing with disappointments. We'll cover as much as we can over the next hour to hour and a half. So we have a little time together as well. So Mairtín Crawford asks in that first poem, Moyra, what are we looking for? The $1 million question.
Yes.
But let's kind of begin with, you know, what have we liked in the past, or what have we admired in the submissions that came in? And I'm just thinking back to last year's winners, and what was it about their submissions that really kind of grabbed our attention?
Yes, I mean, I think, you know, one of the things I think that when you're reading through a lot of poems, I think that that kind of individual voice, that kind of sense that someone is speaking very specifically in their voice, and you're hearing their voice. I think for me, that's one of the things that when something, I suppose in a way, really stops you in your tracks, that there's something here that you can't ignore. It's quite hard. I mean, on top of that, there's all the kind of, I suppose, the technical aspect in a way of, you know, is it, you know, is the poem well written? But that voice, that initial voice, I think, is one of the things that for me feels really important.
Yeah, I agree with that. A poem can be functioning technically and you know, can be well presented on the page, but we have to feel connected to a writer speaking out of their own world. And I'm thinking back to the joint winners that we had last year, and I'm thinking of Catherine's work, Catherine Bevis, and it was so kind of folkloric, and it was like a fable, and you felt like you were being pulled into a world where things were quite old and but also shifting, and there was something really mesmerizing, wasn't there, about
There was.
voice, that you just kept going back and thinking, you know, I'm really arrested by that.
Yeah.
And then similarly with the other
with
winners,
Jim, yeah.
his work, you know, he has a very distinct world that he draws from, which is the rural landscape, and a richness of imagery that would kind of stop you in your tracks, really.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think both of the poets, and I mean, it was very unusual. It's the first year that there have been joint winners. And I mean, I think just both voices, as you know, we couldn't separate them in the end because they were both so absolutely distinctive, but also absolutely succeeded in what, and quite different as well.
Yeah.
There was a great kind of intensity of imagery in Jim's work. And as you were saying, then that kind of more folkloric, more, I suppose in a way, mystical almost element to Catherine's work. So I think, that there isn't, it's not that we're looking for a particular type of poem or a particular type of writing, or it's just how the work impacts on you when you read it, I think is what we're looking for to some extent, at least. Yeah.
And a good tip, I think, is to let go of the poem that you think you should write, or the poem that the judges might want, or the poem that is timely. Or, I mean, you might be writing poems that are of the times, and that's really where your heart is. But I think it's wrong to go down a route of thinking, well, this poem has currency at this particular moment
Yeah.
in time, or it speaks to a political moment, or it carries a theme that is of the times. You kind of have to put that aside and really write out of your own world, as distinct and maybe niche or strange or obscure or abstract as that might be. That's the thing that we are interested in.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is
Yeah.
your inner world.
Yes, and follow your own passions and what it is that you want to write and what you want to say. Forget about writing to please, as judges or anyone else. Really, it has to be what you want to write, what you feel passionately about.
Mm-hmm. So where do we begin then, or where does any writer begin, Moyra, in terms of kind of gathering inspiration, or getting started, or overcoming the fear of the blank page? Like, how do you in your own practice make a start on a poem or on a project?
I think the blank page is a very daunting thing, as all writers know. I think one of the things that certainly stops me on occasions is when you want it to be really good. When you think, I want to write a really good poem, I think set aside all ideas of writing a good poem, of writing a perfect poem, of writing a prize-winning poem. Just write a poem, put stuff down on the page. As I said, kind of something that you're interested in. It could be anything at all. There are no subjects that are unsuitable for poetry. So I think, rather than waiting to feel as if you have the best idea or a perfect idea, or just put your ideas down on the page. You've got lots of time to edit and go over and think about it. Just those first ideas, get them down on the page. I find that, I don't know about you, Annemarie, but I find that sometimes a little idea will kind of lodge in my head. And before I go anywhere near the page with it, I allow it to kind of be there for a while and see what else might come and join it, or what other thoughts might come to it, maybe jot a few things down. So I think, don't rush to feel that you've got to get the poem on the page. Allow it to kind of maybe even sit in your mind for a while and just see what comes of that initial idea.
And do you have little strategies for yourself, or steps that you take if you're feeling stuck, or if you're feeling that the poem is lodged and you're not able to get the first draft onto the page? Like, what would be your go-to strategies?
I actually think it's a really good idea to kind of just maybe go for a walk, or rather than concentrate on the page, go for a walk. I think that, that rhythm of walking, and that opportunity to kind of just let your head think about it without you. That might sound a bit strange, but think about it without your kind of desires and ambitions getting in the way, and then come back. And even if all you get down is a few notes or a few phrases or something, just to kind of just to get you started. What
Yeah.
about you? What's your kind of go-to for?
Yeah, absolutely. Getting away from the desk is
Yeah,
really important for me. I mean, I found writing and editing during the lockdown was particularly tough because I don't write my best stuff, you know, at the desk, and so I had to kind of like bend a few rules to, you know, get a walk on the beach and yeah, kind of let the thoughts air. Uh,
Yes.
so I would just take a notebook and I would go to somewhere that has a bit of resonance, poetic resonance for me. It could be the beach, it could be doing a hike, but just getting out of that intellectual space. I mean, we
Yes.
intellectualize our poems so much and
Yeah.
place so much intellectual pressure on what we want them to do, and we can forget that, you know, so often they're coming out of the subconscious self, and they are like dreams that kind of, you know, revolve out of us, and you have to kind of honor that side of things as well.
Yeah.
So I would do that, and then sometimes I would kind of bolster my own desk work around poetry by reading essays or an excerpt of a novel, or definitely reading poetry by other people, but reading in another form, you know, other than poetry really helps
Yeah.
as well. Um, I mean, you're always reading other poetry, but sometimes an essay on the subject that you're trying to write about, um, or looking to, you know, I'd also watch quite a lot of film as well. So if there's a subject that I'm writing about and I want to see it through another lens, I'd have a look. Is there any good documentaries? Is there any good films on that? So you're just trying to come at it from different angles to,
Yeah.
as you said, dislodge that idea or that first
Yeah.
draft that you have sitting there.
I think that's really important, Annemarie, in terms of, you know, I think people sometimes think the idea of kind of research and poetry don't really go together. But I mean, I love, you know, if I have an idea for something, then reading around it, or as you say, maybe watching a documentary or reading something. And so that although those things may not make it into the poem, they form the kind of universe of the poem and allow you to have information that I suppose then informs the poem, even though it may not necessarily enter the poem itself. And I think it's really important as a writer in general to kind of just be interested in everything. And, you know, if something strikes you, no matter what it might be, to follow up on that and to go and look at it and to, because I think if you just think all the time about writing poems, it can be very daunting, really. So I think just allow your interest to come in and read around them and have that kind of background of information.
Mhm. And all of that helps kind of cultivate an obsession, doesn't it, with the subject? Like I've been writing recently responses to the histories of famine workhouses. So I've been reading novels on the subject, and I've been reading, you know, watching documentaries and reading reports. But then the more that I get into it, you know, you start to watch how somebody's eating a meal, or watch the language that people are using when they're talking about eating. I'm starving, you know. You know, you start listening. It's like it comes into your consciousness then.
Yes.
Subject.
Yeah.
And then everywhere you look, then you're seeing little traces of, you know, what you're writing about, and then, you know, you're in the zone, and that's,
Yes.
I think that's what we mean when we talk about research. But people can find that such a, as you said, a daunting word, but it's not so much research as just cultivating your curiosity and your
Yes.
obsession,
Yeah.
and that kind of bubble up to the surface.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So, kind of another kind of an extension of that question, and I think it might be useful for participants to think about, Moyra, is how do we revisit old work that we haven't published, or drafts or notes that we have lying around, and, you know, we haven't, you know, brought them to completion, but they might be the bones of a poem or a sequence of poems. I'm just thinking of people here that have folders and bits of writing that they've previously discounted. It's not working, or it's not kind of coming to an end. You know, is now a good time to go back to that stuff and to kind of see if you can rework it? Like, would you revisit drafts that haven't worked previously, and how do you approach that?
Yeah. I mean, well, you mentioned earlier in, you know, a notebook. And you know, similarly, I would have a notebook where I would jot down ideas and thoughts and maybe one line of something, and they don't necessarily come to anything at the time, but I think going back to those notes, and you know, there might be a phrase or there might be an idea that jumps out at you that you want to go back to. And I think, you know, quite often our unconscious or our subconscious works on those things in the meantime. So when you go back to it, you might think, oh, right now I know what I was,
Yeah.
you know, what I was wanting from that, or now I have a better idea of what that poem needs to be, or,
Yeah.
and I think sometimes, I mean, I think sometimes, I don't know about you, Annemarie, but sometimes you have an idea for a poem and you just can't get it to work, you know, and you know it's there. And I think just kind of revisiting it every now and again to see, is there anything new that you've thought about it? Is there anything that kind of, I mean, I had an idea for years about a poem about war elephants. And I couldn't find a way to write it. And then suddenly I just kind of, it clicked in some way that I was able to do it. So I think all of those notes and ideas and early drafts are all material that you could go back to and use and make good use of. I mean, they're in your notebook for a reason.
Yes, yeah. There's a wonderful essay by Joan Didion on keeping a notebook. Have I got that right? On keeping a notebook? Gosh, I hope I have the title of that correct. Anyway, it's online. It's free to read. If you're not in a position to get the book or borrow from the library, and I'd really recommend it. There's also an essay by Joan Didion titled "Why I Write." And it's a response to the original George Orwell essay, but that's a really useful one for kind of taking a step back from your writing and just reflecting on themes and subjects and why it is that you write. I always encourage people in workshops to go to that essay, Why I Write, and to do your own response to it. And that might be kind of a practical tip for writers here if you're looking to just kind of take a moment out and reflect on where you might go with your submissions thematically. Something else I was going to say there about revisiting work. Oh yes, see, I started an elegy in 2014 for someone who had someone close to me that had lost quite suddenly, and the bones of that elegy, you know, stayed around for so long, because I couldn't find a way of organizing it, you know. And I was thinking about it this morning that the breakthrough came for me many years later when
Yeah.
I found the correct form, and
Yes.
about 5 or 6 years after writing the first draft of the elegy, I picked up a book that was all in tercet 3-line forms, and I thought, my God, if I go back to my very out of shape first draft elegy and put it into these 3-line stanzas, it might give it a new shape, and it gave it a whole new lease of life, you know. So sometimes it can be something as simple as finding the right form, you know, and
Yes.
going
Yeah.
back, taking what you had drafted originally and thinking, I'll put this into couplets, you know,
Yeah.
I'll put it into a formal structure,
Mm.
or I'll take it out of a formal structure,
Yeah.
or I'll put it into first person. I mean, sometimes when I'm really stuck with something as well, I put it into the first person, just even temporarily. And that speaking from the I allows me to get closer to the subject and to unlock detail. And then I can put it back into the third person later.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Or sometimes something's written in the past tense and I decide to put it into the present. So, you know, just when you're going back to drafts on your computer, think, how can I give this another turn of the screw, and how can I challenge it and just do something to it that is intentional, to see if that unlocks a kind of new layer of
Yeah.
meaning.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that shifting of tense is something that I find really useful sometimes, that it just kind of changes the poem. But also, I think, I mean, you're talking about, you know, putting something into form. Sometimes I think, you know, you might have decided. I mean, I can remember one particular instance where I decided, I can't even remember now what it was, but that this poem was in, you know, 4-line stanzas and I couldn't get it to work. And then suddenly I had this kind of light bulb moment that, you know, it was only you decided it was in 4-line stanzas. It doesn't have to be, you know, you can actually change that. And once I let go of that, then the poem began to work. So I think don't become too fixed on, you know, because it started off this way, it has to stay this way. You know, allow the poem to change shape, to change form if it needs to.
And it's a heartbreaker, isn't it, when you
You've done
realize,
lots of work and you think, yeah, yeah,
or when the thing that the seed that began the poem, the beautiful opening lines or the image or the metaphor, when you realize that's the thing now that has to go for the poem to work,
yes, yeah,
you kind of take time to reconcile yourself to that. But that's the joys of going back and editing drafts that you wrote a few months ago or a few years ago.
yeah,
You'll go back with completely fresh eyes and you'll be kind of stronger within yourself to make those hard decisions and
yeah,
know the things that you were
yeah,
once so close to.
yeah. And I think, I mean, in a workshop recently, I was looking at a poem from the um, wonderful new collection from Emma Must, The Ballad of Yellow Wednesday. And the date on one of the poems, it was something that had happened in 1993. And one of the participants in the workshop had said, my goodness, has it taken her, you know, whatever, 30 years to write about that? And we kind of talked around that in terms of, um, you know, everything doesn't have to be an immediate response to something. You know, sometimes things that have sat in your life or in your memory for a very long time, there is a time then when it's right to write about them. I don't know if that makes sense, but you know, I think don't kind of feel that it has to be something fresh and urgent, and you know that allow the past to come forward as well.
It's a slow art, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
it's like slow cooking, you know.
Yes.
Let it
Yeah.
simmer and let it marinate, and there's usually nothing to be gained by rushing,
By rushing, no.
which is why I just think uh, people who are thinking of submitting shouldn't discount going back to older stuff. Do you cast off much material, Moyra, or do you keep everything, or what is your process?
I more or less keep everything because I mean, I think even if you don't use it, I think it's really interesting to see your process and to see how you've moved through things as well. I mean, I have a kind of a, you know, I've got a plan to bonfire it all if I get an opportunity before before anyone else gets hold of it, you know. But yeah, I think I keep most things. Yeah.
I'm the
What
same.
about you? Do you? Yeah.
I'm the same. I keep absolutely everything. You know, even the stuff that I think, gosh, if that ever saw the light of day, I'd be
Yes.
mortified. And it is a worry, isn't it? It's like something happened to me. Is somebody going to go into my computer,
Yeah.
well-meaning, and decide?
Yes. Did you really think that?
So that's the next kind of big question. When is a poem finished? When do we know, okay, this work, I can't do any more with it and it's ready to be submitted to the Mairtín Crawford Award or to another award? Like, what would be your benchmark for the poem that's done?
Well, I think for me personally, it's when I think the thing is to never say that'll do. You know, I think if you're at any point saying that'll do, it's not finished, you know. So I think you have to keep going with it until you kind of feel that you have done all you can with it. You know, it may not be perfect, it may not be exactly what you want, but you know that you have kind of um, wrestled with it to the extent that it's as good as you can make it at that point in time.
Yes.
Um, don't be content with, you know, with feeling that, oh, that line's not great, but it'll do, you know, just don't do that.
Mhm. I agree. I agree. It's almost like you have to become the I feel like the defender of my poems, you know, that I have every comma, every space, every word. I've come to an intentional, purposeful decision that that is what I need in that space and nothing else will do, which is
Yes,
why it's such a slow art. Um, you know, you kind of have to wrestle with all the associations of every word. Why this word and not the five other alternatives? Like
yeah,
for me, it's like a process of elimination. I know that in this space, this line or this word could go in multiple variations, and I have to just narrow it down and say, no, this is the only one that will do. And
yeah,
that is a very time consuming, fastidious process. It's like lifting grains of rice with a tweezers. Right?
yes,
Um,
yeah,
but you can tell when you read a poem when somebody has rigorously gone through that process. You know,
yes,
it's always amazing to me that even people who say, I don't read poetry or I don't listen to poetry, I know nothing about poetry, but they can tell, like even a general audience can tell when a poem has been put into place exactly and with intention. So,
yes, yeah.
yeah, I think
And it can feel, I think it can feel, you know, I enjoy doing it, you know, but I think there are times when you can feel a little bit kind of obsessional about things because, you know, changing one word backwards and forwards or taking out a comma and putting in a full stop and then changing it back again. But I think that's part of the process.
yes.
Um, and
And
that's what at the end of the day makes a poem um you know, that you can say, yes, this is how I want it to be, that you can know that about it. Yeah.
And that's what makes the form so interesting to us is the way that writers, that poets obsess over things like where a line is broken. I mean, I remember one of the entries that came into us a few years ago, and it was placed in the award, and we were just amazed, weren't we, at how the line was broken, and you'd think that the sentence or the thought was complete, and next thing the line would be broken and I would follow up with another line that changed the whole context of the previous line.
That's right. Yeah.
So we were being pushed and we were being pulled in the poem back and forth through time and space and meaning. And by the end of it, you know, this short poem, the use of the lines had just left us completely disorientated. And I just
Yeah.
remember thinking, that is a brilliant submission, because
Yes.
what that person is doing with form has obviously taken them so much time as well to get this right.
Yeah.
So that time spent tinkering will be very apparent to
Yeah.
judges,
It's
readers.
time well spent. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I do remember going to Annemarie a few years ago, and I had 2 weeks. I remember what a luxury to have that time. But I had made out a little timetable for myself. You know, one poem that I was going to edit a day, 14 poems, brilliant. You know, I was going to come home with this whole sequence, and I started day one, and there was couldn't get beyond the first poem, and the whole 2 weeks was spent just moving that poem
Yes.
around. The last poem on in my first book is called Market Prayer, and I at the end of the 2 weeks I did feel kind of dejected, thinking I've just spent a whole residency on one poem, you know. But ever since, that is a poem that people go back to. That's a poem that people ask to republish, to translate, to read. That one short poem developed this life that I could never have imagined for it. And I'm convinced now it's because of that time spent tinkering over the 2 weeks with it.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, it's just the nature of the process, isn't it?
It
That
is. Yeah.
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 So a poem is finished when we think every word is in place and nothing more can be done with it. And I'm trying to think of any other useful advice. And it's left to sit for a while as well.
Yes. Yeah.
Um, And then what about bringing the poem to, like, do you have people that you send your poem to for feedback? Would you bring it to a workshop? Like, would you put it in front of the eyes of other people before you deem it finished?
I do. I suppose the whole way through my, through my life writing poetry, I've always had a group of people. Um, when I say a group, a few people, and they haven't always been the same people over the years, but um, who I trust their judgment. I trust them to be kind of honest with me about things. I also, there are people that I know are serious about their writing, that kind of share that desire to make things as good as you can make them. So I would always have a few trusted people that I would, we share each other's work and look at each other's work. Um, I think, I mean, as you know, Annemarie, writing is a very solitary experience most of the time. And I think it's really good to have that feedback, not even just the feedback, but also kind of to throw ideas around and, talk about what you're obsessing about at the moment, or talk about a collection, or talk about something that you've read. um, to have those conversations and ideas and share in that way, as well as just sharing your work. I think that's really important.
I'm just wondering if people are kind of struggling with what to include in their submission, it might be a useful exercise to find a sympathetic reader and to say, okay, I've got these 10 poems, like what do get a second opinion on,
Yeah,
what do you think would be, the top kind of, 5 poems out of this.
yeah.
And
Yes,
it's
because sorry, I was just going to say, I do think that sometimes you can become so close to your work that it's very hard to kind of see it. And I think that that's, to have someone else come in and kind of have that more objective view of it at a certain point can be really useful. Yeah.
I mean, I know that that has happened to me. I've shown a manuscript to a fellow writer, and they've said, "Oh my gosh, your sequence of poems that you wrote for another project is not in here." And I would have discounted them and thought, oh, they don't fit the manuscript, and just had that conversation then, with someone that saying, advising, oh no, you should put them in. And so that kind of, once you bring your work to another person, a conversation will happen, and it might not be like a clear answer or instruction or piece of advice you get, but it'll just allow you to have a back and forth and to kind of
Yeah.
tease out. Like if there are people who are struggling with what to put in their Mairtín Crawford selection, I'd say even put together a bunch of poems and get that second opinion from another writer.
I think that's a really good idea. Yeah. Yeah.
And that'll give you a good indication, to yeah. Well, it'll just clarify for yourself maybe, thoughts that you have already.
Yeah.
So how should writers present their poems on the page, Moyra, for this, in terms of laying out and formatting? Will we run through kind of some technicalities of what the poetry should look like on a page? And some people will be very familiar with this process because they're sending out work already, but there'll also be people in this group and maybe that, they're not so familiar with presenting work.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that, the kind of first and foremost is read the submission criteria, wherever it is that you're submitting to. If it's asking you for a certain font size, if it's asking you for a number of lines, whatever it might be, make sure you have stuck to those submission criteria, because, it's awful to kind of put a lot of work into a submission and for it to fail on something, that it didn't need to fail on. So be really careful, I think, about have you stuck to what you're being asked. And then after that, I think it's just really, do things like, check spelling, check, that the format hasn't changed when you've been shifting it from one place to somewhere else, any of those things, because no matter how good a poem is, I think when you're reading it, if there are little errors like that, it affects your reading of the poem, and it kind of it doesn't allow the poem to speak in the way that it needs to. So just be really, editing on a kind of copy edit way is the last thing you do. I think when you've done all the kind of creative editing and all the work on the poem, make sure that the poem, looks and appears the way you want it to.
Yes, yes. And, on a fundamental level, the poem on your Microsoft Word page should replicate the general standard shape and layout of a poem in a published book.
Yes.
And that seems like a very obvious thing to say. However, you'd be amazed the entries that come in and they have size 14 font, or they have Comic Sans, or they don't have a title in bold, or the poem is not indented to the right hand side of the page, or the poem is starting halfway down the page. What you want to do in any submission, sending work out anywhere, is you want to draw the editor or the judge's eye to the fact that this poem looks first of all visually very like a poem in a published book.
Yes.
And that's why you go with a classic font. Maybe you don't use classic fonts in your other parts of your life, that's fine, but you don't want to start differentiating your poem out visually on the page like that. Like, if I get a poem and it's size 14 font and it's double, triple spacing and it's Comic Sans, I mean, that's a horror immediately for my eye, to look at and take in. Whereas if I get the Garamond font 11, 1.5 spacing, and it looks exactly like something in a published book, it's working, you're working on the subconsciousness of the person who's reading it. So it sounds very kind of basic, and it sounds very kind of strict, but there are good reasons why, paying careful attention to that standard format is really useful. Now, within that, your form might be doing different things. We're just talking about font and line spacing. And now you might be doing something deliberately intentional with line spacing that demands you to move text around a different page. Of course, that's, if that's your intention, is to, disrupt the form on the page or do something experimental, then that's absolutely fine. But if you're trying to present your lyric poem, and you're not doing anything intentional with form or shape, then stick to what a published poem looks like, I suppose.
No, we're not saying that all the poems have to be a little box in the center of the page, but we have to, it has to be intentional. If it's if you're using white space and you're using different enjambments and all of those kind of things.
So we've touched on this a little bit already, but maybe we could talk about it a bit further, Moyra. What range of material should writers think of putting in their application? And this is a big question that comes up year after year. Should my poems in the selection be thematically linked, or should they all be very different and show the range of what I do? Or, should they be an excerpt from a bigger project? Or how do we approach that? Maybe got lots of different pieces of work, and how do we know what to put into the actual application?
It's a difficult question, isn't it? Because I think I'm just thinking about our two winners last year. They were quite thematic in terms of the submission, but I don't think that was. I think it's the voice, isn't it? It's the kind of. I don't think the themes matter. I don't think the subject matters. I think it's the voice behind them, and I think they certainly don't have to be themed. I think if you're working on a particular group of poems, it maybe is worthwhile looking at submitting those, because they will sit together, they will kind of pull together. On the other hand, if you want to show various styles, you can feel free to do that. It's kind of speaking for both of us here, but I don't think either of us have fixed thoughts on whether they need to be themed or not, or it's the overall poetic voice behind whatever the submission is.
Yes, I suppose there's no clear kind of cut answer to that. I mean, we're open to reading everything. We're open to reading excerpts from our project. We're open to poems that are from, all have different themes. We're kind of, but what I would say is just be intentional with whatever you put into the selection.
Yes.
It doesn't matter whether I'm doing like a reading or publishing a book or submitting a sequence of poems for a project. I'm always thinking, well, what is the arc of this information that I'm presenting? Like, what is the first poem that I'm reading or publishing, and what is the last one, and what happens in the kind of middle of that arc? So, I would always keep in mind that there's kind of there's an opening point to a reading or a submission. There's, a heart of it, and there's an end. But within that, you can do anything, or you can disrupt that. But I would generally keep that in the forefront of my mind. So I'm just thinking, how would that work if I was doing a Mairtín Crawford Award? Well, for me personally, I probably wouldn't, my style is I probably wouldn't deliver all long poems. I would kind of, I might choose to balance that with long and short poems, but that's just because I have, that arc in my head of how I want to present. So it's just about being intentional.
Yes.
What represents your style best? Maybe your style is short staccato. You do all short poems, or maybe it's kind of endurance and you're interested in the longer poem, and it is all long poems, but just be intentional about what represents your style.
Yeah Absolutely. Yeah.
So I have another question here. Oh yes, so this is a great one. What are the common mistakes that applicants make? So Moyra, you've been doing this for how many years have you been judging this?
Since it started in 2017. So
okay.
Yeah.
So I because I want to hear this myself. So across all of that kind of time, what have you seen to be the big errors that people make in their applications?
Well, I think kind of going back a little bit to what we were talking about a few minutes ago is just that kind of, where people haven't formatted it correctly, or, that they haven't adhered to the rules of the competition. And it's always kind of quite sad to see that, because you think someone's gone to the effort of putting this together and sending it in, and just, maybe they didn't read something properly, or they, or there's a name included on a page which immediately disqualifies the poem, or, so just that kind of idea of being really careful, of double checking that you've got everything right, that your submission is as it should be. I mean, I think that, that is the most common error, really. I think, you do very occasionally kind of get people who do things like put little pictures on the page, or, don't do anything like that. Just kind of have it as a professional submission. I think that's very important, really.
Yeah, it's a real heartbreak, isn't it, when you are reading through a submission and you're thinking, this is really arresting, it's not my attention, and then next thing, there's a title with a big like typo in it.
Yeah.
Or there, a spelling error, or a line has been broken at something like the, or something silly.
Yes.
And a big clanger there in the middle of the submission. And it's hard, it's difficult then when it comes down to, us having a discussion and we're wrestling back and forth, and you know, it comes down to then the very fine detail.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the submission might still make it into the shortlisted pile, or it might still, but when it comes down to choosing, you know, the last awardees, then we will look at things like
Yes.
or the line break that, you know, is kind of without point, or I'm trying to think what else came up last year.
Yeah. I mean, I think it is, you know, just as you're indicating, I think when it comes down to shortlist and kind of you know, decision at that point, we are looking at those tiny things because the standard is so high, really, and the work is so good when but you know, that sometimes a small thing can be what something turns on. So I think it's just, you know, be careful, make sure your line breaks. And I do think that kind of thing of, you know, I know it's happened to me that when you maybe transfer a file to somewhere, or you kind of, you know, to just make sure that it has transferred in the same way as you wanted it to be. Yeah.
I mean, when I'm sending out work generally as a practice, I would, I don't know if you do this, but I would usually send two versions. I send one in a Word and I send one in a PDF. And at the very least, you know, I mean, you don't have to do that in this case, but at the very least, that means that, you know, the editor can cross check. And if they think something funny is happening with the format, they can go to the PDF and, you know, realize.
Yeah. I mean, I think we did have an example of that last year where, you know, we were kind of startled by these very strange line endings, and it turned out when we went back to check, which we did, that it was the format that had somehow become disturbed in the meantime, you know, internally in our system rather than it being in the poet's system. So I think we are very careful to go back to the original and make sure that we have what the poet intended us to have. Yeah.
I mean, it's just heartbreaking to think that your submission might get to the very last stages, and then because of a silly typing error or spelling error, or something gone corrupt, that it is kind of taken out of the race, you know, and
Yeah.
you really have to be so careful. Okay, so we have touched a little bit on this. How do I manage this and other poetry submissions in terms of time and cost? And yeah, managing your poetry submissions. This might seem like a kind of strange idea to people who are just starting out, but there's a huge amount of effort that goes into sending work out and keeping track of it, and knowing that, you know, sometimes a poem can't be submitted to a second journal if it's submitted to a first. And how do you keep track of all of that world of administration that goes with poetry?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I mean, I do know people who use spreadsheets, and you know, I'm not a spreadsheet kind of person really, but I simply make a note of what I've sent where. I make sure when I get you know, a response to that, whether it's an acceptance or a rejection, that I note that that poem is either published or else free to be sent somewhere else. So I think just keeping a note, however you do that, whether it's again in a notebook or online on your computer, whatever it might be, and just making sure that you know where your poems are, and you know, you know what the response to that submission has been, and you make a note of it. I mean, I think it's really, you know, again, we're kind of back to submission criteria and things. You know, if a journal says no, what's the word I'm looking for? No submissions, simultaneous submissions. You know, make sure you do that, and make sure you know where your poems are. And I think the whole, you know, there's a kind of a side to writing that I suppose when you're starting off, you don't really think about it too much. I mean, I think I used to imagine that your poems kind of just somehow magically went
Yes.
off into the ether and you didn't have to think about any of that stuff, you know. So there's a real practical side to, you know, keeping abreast of deadlines, of, you know, keeping a note of when a submission closes, that you might want to submit something to it. So there's all that kind of, as you say, admin side, which you kind of don't think about a lot when you're starting off, but is very important as well. And working towards submission dates, it can be a great motivator to put the work in on a poem if you know that you really want to send it into something on a particular date.
Yeah, you have to become quite adept at the housekeeping, don't you? Be around the poems. And I mean, one thing that you should always avoid the temptation of is sending poems out and then hassling the editor
Yes,
when you are going to get a response, even though it's very tempting. And even, I realize that some of the waitlist times are so, ridiculously long and unfair to writers. But as a practice, well, I myself have tried to cultivate the practice of just sending the work out, keeping a log of it in my Excel, and then disappearing it from my inbox, so that it's not on my mind, it's gone out, and I'll know when I know.
Yeah, there's no point in thinking about it once you've sent it out.
And there's no point dwelling, creating anxiety around it, waiting every day for the response. I mean, I absolutely realize, that's a very human thing when you've sent out your poem, especially in the early stages. But no matter when I sent out an application for anything, residency funding, I always try and give it the attention it needs right up to the deadline, and then do my level best to kind of disappear it from my because otherwise, it becomes a torment.
I think you're kind of touching as well on the kind of the whole side that I think everyone finds difficult, and that's rejection. I mean, it's we all get more rejections than acceptances. It's just what happens. But it can still be, no matter what stage you're at, it can still feel like a real kind of blow to have something rejected, particularly when, you maybe feel it had merit, or you were very hopeful for it, or, so that's something that we kind of have to learn to deal with. I think it's fine to feel a bit gutted about it or miserable for a day, but then you've got to just and I think to keep in mind as well that there are lots of reasons why poems are rejected. It's not, it doesn't necessarily say it was a bad poem at all. It means that it didn't fit the theme of that magazine at that time, or there were too many poems about that particular subject. So but rejection is something that it can be quite difficult, I think, to cope with.
And you've mentioned something, really interesting there, that I really hadn't realized until I started editing journals, is that sometimes it's as simple as you have already got a poem on that subject. And you can't have 3, 4, 5 poems on that subject. You can only have one. So the reasons why your poem was maybe not accepted can be so varied, and things that you don't ultimately have control over them, so you kind of have to let it go from your mind. And I have that 24-hour rule as well. I allow myself to brood over the rejection or disappointment, and then just onwards. And
I think what helps with that is what we were talking about earlier, that you haven't sent the poem out. I think, I mean, I have done it on occasions where you've sent a poem out because there's a deadline, and you think, well, it's, maybe it's not quite how I want it, but I'll send it in. And, I think if you feel satisfied that you've done the work on the poem, I think in a way it's almost easier to take those rejections then, because you think, well, it's not because I failed to finish this poem. It's, I feel happy with the poem, and I think that's that's a good way to look at it too. That if you're happy with it, send it somewhere else.
Absolutely. The same poem might
Yeah,
find a home somewhere else
yeah,
really quickly. And there's one thing for sure is that every single writer and poet at every stage of their career, it doesn't matter how successful they are, but they are dealing with disappointment.
yeah,
And it's a thing that you have to get used to as well in your practice.
yeah,
And again, be intentional. How are you going to deal with that? What's your strategy for picking yourself up again? Just be mindful that it's absolutely something that we all have to deal with.
yeah.
Okay, so will we go to some questions?
Yeah, there seem to be. Shall we have a look at the chat and see what?
So we have one question here. When dealing with submissions, do you prefer to see a range or just a collection of strong poems that stand on their own? So we have kind of covered that question, haven't we? We've kind of indicated that you should think intentionally about the arc of the submission. Does it represent your style? And maybe putting it in front of another reader as well to get a second opinion before you send it in. And similarly, we have additional question on that. What about mixing styles, long form poetry, haiku, haibun, sonnet, villanelle? Is that accepted?
Absolutely, yes. Yeah,
Why not?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I see a question there about someone who has self-published. Would that be considered as previously published? I'll just double check in the terms and conditions.
That's a
But
good.
I'm pretty sure that yeah, those who've been self-published are eligible to enter. So that's yeah.
Okay. Is it too disruptive to introduce I halfway or further into a poem? I love how particular poets are.
Yes,
This is the kind
yeah.
of question that I would ask.
And I suppose the answer to that is we'd have to see the poem.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. I think there isn't a kind of yes or no answer to that. I think it's, is that what the poem needs to happen? I don't think it is necessarily too disruptive. I don't know what you think, Annemarie.
Yeah, and maybe you want to be disruptive. Maybe that's the point of the poem, that it's aiming
Yeah,
to disrupt. So it's really difficult to say until we see the poem. What I would say is if you have a doubt about it yourself, it's definitely worth spending time with it, because so much of this form is instinctual and intuitive. And if you yourself are having a niggling doubt about this I halfway through a poem, then that would be a flag for me that the edit
yeah,
is not finished yet.
yeah.
The edit
And
is
it's
finished when all of those little kind of flags have been dealt with.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Sorry, I interrupted you there, Moira. Did you want to say something?
Well, no, I was just going to say that, we were talking about running your work past a kind of a trusted writer friend who, maybe that's the kind of instance where you might want to get someone else's response to it and see, has the disruption had the effect you want it to, or has it not worked?
Mm-hmm. Do you as judges always read the poems in hard copy? I actually don't know how you read them at your end, so I'm interested to. We get a lot of submissions, first of all. We get hundreds and hundreds of submissions.
Yeah.
So, like my preference is always to read them in hard copy, but what I've been doing is kind of doing an initial reading first of all. So I normally go through 4 or 5 stages of readings, and each time I'm whittling them down before I meet Moira, so they get read a lot. So at the initial outset, I don't hard copy everything. I just couldn't. But I'd be that initial kind of reading would also be taking out stuff that's not eligible. you know, that's kind of, it's not really legible. You know, I'd be taking out the stuff that is absolutely not functioning on the page. So that stuff for me wouldn't be printed. And then at, you know, a later point, I'd go into printing the hard copies. And by the time it comes down to that long list, like, you know, you're living with the hard copy poems.
Yeah.
You know, to
Yeah.
really, I'm absolutely a big believer in reading off the page. What about
Yeah.
you, Moyra?
No, it would be very similar because, I mean, I think, you know, as you're saying, the quantity of submissions there are, it would really, when the competition first started, actually, the Crescent Arts Centre and the Belfast Book Festival sent out hard copy. But I think over the years, that initial reading for me is done on screen. But any submission that I feel is you know is coming up through the that I want to look at more, I then that is printed out. And as you say, when we get to the end of the process, I mean, we are, as you say, living with the hard copy poems for quite a period of time. Yeah.
What about naming people in a poem? Is it better to use pronouns, or does a name make it all more real? It's an interesting question. Again, very specific to the writing.
Yeah. I think that's a really interesting question, because I think sometimes, you know, when I'm maybe editing poems, working with someone on a collection or on a group of poems, sometimes when I'm doing an initial read of them and there's a he or a her or a they in it, um, you know, sometimes I find myself going, who's that? You know, because I think it can feel very vague. You know,
Yes.
so I think you know, naming people generally is quite, you know, because it allows you to know if someone's being addressed in the poem, it allows you to know a little bit about who that person is. They're not just this kind of anonymous pronoun, they are a real person. So that's my kind of my take on it. I don't know what you think, Annemarie.
Yes, it's a form in which specificity is everything, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know, poetry is the art of naming. So again, if you're not naming, then you must have a very, you know, a purpose for that, or
Yes.
a very kind of exacting reason why you're not naming. And then, you know, that's doing what you mean it to do. But yeah, I mean, that vagueness, unless it's part of the poem,
Yeah.
uh, you know, it can kind of turn you off as a
Yeah.
reader. Yeah.
Yeah, because I think, I mean, you're trying to bring your reader into the world of the poem, and if there are bits of information missing from that world, then it's impossible for the reader to fully enter it with you.
So somebody asks, are there any examples of a literary CV that I can find somewhere online? I don't know how to format a literary CV. Yeah, we could do a whole workshop on that, couldn't we? It's like my literary CV is like a live document that I have on my desktop, and I have all of the headings and the format, and then the information on it keeps changing, you know, every couple of months as I update it, and I put on some things and I take off other things. But you know, a common mistake, you don't need a literary CV for this award, but for other awards or project funding, a common mistake is to take your CV from another part of your life, you know, your job as a researcher or teacher, or you know, working for a company, and sending that in with your literary application, and you know, it has lots of irrelevant information, and the effect of that is that you present yourself in an artistic setting as somebody who's busy doing something else. You know, it really doesn't, it's not going to work in your favor. So I would always say you should have your literary CV, which is totally different, and your literary CV will have things like readings, residencies, workshops that you've participated on, publications, and then at the very end of your CV you might have, you know, other information, which is, I'm also a teacher at this school, or I'm also a lawyer, or I'm also, but you know, it shouldn't be
Yeah,
the
the focus is on your literary career rather than anything else.
But
Yeah.
I'm not aware of where you could. I mean, what you could do is you could ask again, kind of a trusted mentor or trusted writing friend, if you could borrow from their format. But to me, the literary CV, like any piece of text, to me is something I like to tinker with. That's what poets do, and my literary CV is exactly the same. You know, I tinker with it. For different opportunities, I might kind of change it up, change the headings, change the tone of it.
Yeah. Yes, I think you can put a slightly different emphasis on it depending on whether it's maybe a residency or some other kind of reading opportunity or whatever it might be. And I also think that idea of kind of keeping it up to date as you go along, because there's nothing worse than kind of thinking, oh, I need a CV, but I haven't looked at it for a year, so I've got to remember everything. Just add to it as you go along. I think it for me is important. Yeah.
Yeah, like if I'm applying for something in the US, then I would bump up all of the readings that I think they'll recognize, the opportunity, the languages, opportunities, it's not the languages, sorry, the language that will resonate, with that audience. Whereas if I'm applying for something in Ireland, it would be a different kind of CV. So even within your literary CV, you tailor that then. Is it being sent out in Ireland? Is it being sent out abroad? Etc., etc. But we literally could do a whole workshop on that. I'm afraid that's not a very kind of concise answer. There's lots in that. Are there other questions that we want to take out from there, Moyra?
Let's have a look.
Do you find you both mostly long list the same poems, or do you have big differences in opinion? Oh, that's a great question. Just jogging my memory back now. It feels. Sorry, you go first, Moyra.
Yeah. No, I was. I was just thinking. I mean, I think. From memory, I think we have certainly long listed more or less the same poems. I think when it comes to the kind of final decisions, I think if there's something that either of us feel very strongly about, we make a case for it. In terms of, well, I think this submission really has merit, and we have that discussion around it. But we haven't had huge differences of opinion, and I think that's because really the quality of the poems at the end of the day, when we come to the shortlist and we come to that stage, I think the quality of the poems are such that we both recognize that quality. And then I think the final decision as to the award, that's not done. That's certainly not done lightly, because it is such an important award and an important thing in any poet's career. We spend a lot of time thinking about it and discussing the submissions that are up there, but we haven't had any huge differences of opinion.
No, I think it's always amazing to me whenever judging a poetry competition is the material that has been worked on most carefully will rise to the top and to the judges.
Yeah.
I mean, recently I was co-judging a competition, and I didn't have any conversation with the co-judge. We were told just to give a scoring to the different poems, put them in an Excel out of 10, and then an average would be taken of both our and honestly, when the results came back, they were we had prioritized exactly the same poems, and we had prioritized exactly the same top 3, and the winner was consensual. And so that the art of poetry is such that it showcases attention to detail. And if you're a reader of poetry, you can pick that out really, I'm not going to say easily, but once you've sifted through everything, you really will end up. Often we end up at the same place, don't we, Moyra? Even before we talk,
Yes.
So
Yeah.
we're able to say,
Yeah.
okay, this is the long list.
Yeah. And I think, we've talked a lot about the kind of attention to detail and that side of things. I think the other thing that, almost instinctively as readers of poetry that we hear in poems is the truth, that kind of emotional truth and that emotional honesty. And that, so it's not just the craft and the attention to detail of the poem, which is very important, but there is also that other thing that lifts it then into your, into your heart, I suppose, as well as into your mind.
Yeah. Okay. Just a general question here: how long should you wait before resubmitting the work elsewhere? If you're being kind of slowed down by a journal that doesn't send out rejections very quickly, that is very frustrating. I don't have an easy answer to that.
Well, I
Maybe
suppose if you feel you've waited too long, you can always just withdraw the submission, and then you know that the poem is free to be sent somewhere else if you feel you've waited too long. Yeah.
yeah, that's a decision for everyone to make.
Yeah.
But that's really, part of your wider self-care as a writer. You have to kind of like have your own boundaries about, well, what's causing anxiety in you, or what's causing you to feel stressed. And if a journal has your poem for 9 months and they're not getting back to you and you're getting increasingly kind of distressed about it, then you have to make that decision.
Yeah.
As I said, I've just cultivated it, goes off, and I sometimes forget that I've sent it, and that's what I need to do for my self-care. So it could be out there a year, and but like different people have different things that they need to do to keep themselves on track.
Yeah.
Um,
But at the end of the day, it is your poem, and if you feel you've held
yeah,
on to it for too long
yeah,
and you want it back, just
yeah.
reclaim it. Yeah.
Are you still eligible to apply for the award if you've published a chapbook?
Yes, is the answer to that. Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
There are very clear submission guidelines on the Crescent Book Festival website. So, if you need to check any of those things, please go to the website and have a look. And there are some frequently asked questions that, cover some of the things that people may be wondering about.
I think we have covered all of the questions in the chat. I'm just going through them. I think we've answered them directly, or we've answered them within the kind of body of the talk. Will we kind of wrap up? I don't know, Moira, I was thinking of maybe like I would like to give like one or two resources or signpost people to links or reading that might be useful or inspiring for them. And
I think that would be great. Yes. Yeah.
Well, two kind of takeaways or little kind of seeds that I'll plant with you are the Joan Didion essays, Why I Write and On Keeping a Notebook. If you can stretch to buying Joan Didion's essays, she's really inspiring on the art and craft of writing. If you can't, they're widely available online. And the other thing that might kind of inspire you is the UCD Poetry Archives channel on YouTube, where you can hear readers reading their own poems. And whenever I need to get away from the page, because I spend a lot of time with my head in books, it's lovely to put on that channel and to hear readers reading from their own material. It just, it always gives me a little lift. And again, it's a free resource as well online. Is there anything you want to add to that, Moira?
I think you had mentioned when we were chatting earlier, Annemarie, about the wonderful resource that is Angela. Sorry, I've just forgotten her.
Carr.
Forgotten. Carr.
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, but I mean, it is a really fantastic resource for people if they're not aware of it.
Yeah, it's a monthly bulletin, and it's on her blog page, which is called A Dreaming Skin, and it delivers kind of a outline of all the awards and competitions and opportunities coming up for that month, and you can sign up to it. It's free, but you can also make a small contribution because she does a lot of work collating that newsletter for writers. So it's Angela Carr, A Dreaming Skin, and it's a wonderful kind of thing that you can get into your email, and gives you a snapshot of.
It really is. I mean, it saves, you know, it saves you having to troll through a lot of information and bring it all together. She has done that on all of our behalves, and it's a fantastic resource. Yeah.
Was there something else on our list that we wanted to share with writers as a resource? Oh, the Match in the Dark.
Oh yes.
Yeah. There's a new document created by an organization called Match in the Dark, and it's a pay and rights document, and it's newly launched, and it's just a really interesting report on you know, what ideally writers and poets should be paid in Ireland, and it features a pay scale and case studies, and just in terms of building your own professional practice and thinking about the you know, future and where you might go with your writing. It's a lovely tool to have, and I've been sharing it with everyone. I could put it in the chat here as well. Let me just see if I can find it.
It's a really important document, I think, and it's really great to have it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Even to just start conversations with funders, or to encourage funders, I suppose, to look at the levels that they should be thinking about for writers.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to put that into the chat now as we're speaking. So is there any last words before we wrap up that we need to give people? I guess good luck is the...
Yes, yeah, and we're looking forward to reading your work. I mean, it's a real pleasure. I think, Annemarie, I don't know how you feel about it, but it's a real pleasure to kind of see all this new work coming in, and all these new voices and different voices, and it's an exciting time. Yeah.
I mean, every year we're surprised and amazed, and it just gives us a little lift as well to see the amount of care and attention that people put into the submissions.
Yeah.
And, you know, I always encourage people to think about the fact that, you know, even if your submission is not longlisted, shortlisted, or wins, that work is never lost. You know, that work gets folded back into your practice, and you then have a selection of poems ready that you can, you know, go forward with. So, you know, one way or another, you kind of win, you know.
Yes.
You then have a body of work that you didn't have beforehand. So that's the way to look at it. Yeah.
Okay, good luck, everyone. We look forward to seeing your poems coming in.
Thank you very much. Have a lovely weekend. Go Míle maith agah, Slán.